Daar in Marais sal ek ooit weer kan sê, o my skaat het ek weer gekry. En sonder gedal langs die mooi rivierseval, het sy vir oorlogsdae bly. O bring my terug na die ou Transvaal, daar waar my...
And further, no one denies the admirable fighting qualities of the Boers, nor, in general, their sense of honor. However, those Boers fighting in the northern Transvaal, in commando groups, are outlaws, renegades, often without any recognized form of control, addicted to the wrecking of trains, the looting of farms. Lord Kitchener himself recognized the unorthodox nature of this warfare when he formed a special squad to deal with it, the Bushveldt Carbineers.
Little thing there tells the whole story of
Recruits
the
wanted.
Yeah, read that. Recruits wanted.
Bushveldt Carbineers organised in Pretoria for special service in northern districts of the Transvaal, Waterberg and Soutspannberg. Recruits wanted who can ride and shoot to proceed to Pretoria at once. Now, I can't read the small writing, but
There you are. Okay.
we've noticed that there were like Kitchener's horse,
Kitchener's fighting scouts.
the Scottish horse. These were like private companies formed, almost mercenaries. Would you say the Carbineers were something like that?
I wouldn't. Well, they were offered. They would offered a higher. For lack of military terminology, they were offered an increase in what their normal pay was. That was one of the conditions that they were offered. They were offered rank, which I find the worst of all.
This description of the Boers fighting in the Spelonken, the Soutspannberg ranges would probably be disputed by our Afrikaans friends on the channel. But I think to the British idea of the war ending when Pretoria was occupied, that these bitterenders were probably easier classified as outlaws to explain the treatment towards them and the burning of the farms and that type of behaviour. So we know that there were a lot of Boers that did lay down their arms after the fall of Bloemfontein and Pretoria. But as I remember, because Alan was telling me, perhaps it was Koos Del Rey or Christian de Wet, some of these Boer commando leaders went around to the districts and told them that no, the fight wasn't over, and to take up arms again. A lot of the Boers had signed, acts that they were surrendering and pledging allegiance, but they'd buried their Mausers and their weaponry, and they'd handed in their old bird guns and the old muskets. So they took up arms again, which is probably why we hear the description from Major Thomas, the Australian defence lawyer, that these were renegades and outlaws blowing up trains. So let's see it from that viewpoint. Yeah, hi guys. Welcome to Central Victoria, where this summer of ours seems never ending. We're into March and it's 36 today. That's a hot one. So got my confirmation. I've booked 3 nights in Boer at the Motor Inn from the 30th of April to the 3rd of May. That gives me 3 nights to explore around Boer, and I'm looking for the filming locations for Breaker Morant, the 1980 Bruce Beresford depiction of the Bushveldt Carbineers, in particular Harry Morant. Now I am stopping in Renmark on the way to Boer, and that's where Harry actually enlisted for the Boer War. There's a famous photo of him and half a dozen other guys on horses holding their rifles and they're preparing to ride down to Adelaide to embark. They're probably with the South Australian Imperial Bushmen. There's also a couple of other locations. One of the relatives of Harry Morant had a citrus farm that Harry thought he could drop in and get a job out of the blue. But anyway, we'll talk about that when we're in Renmark. But I thought I might do a series on the Bushveldt Carbineers, a name that's very evocative these days if you're into that sort of thing. I remember asking Charles Leach when I met him, he's the historian that took me around the skirmishes tour, if there'd be any interest in the Bushveldt Carbineers at all without that film, and he wasn't really able to answer that. In our deep dive, we're going to be using a few sources, so I've actually started reading Charles's book, Charles Leach, and that's what gave me the idea for this series. We're going to do 2 or 3 episodes, a deep dive into, I'm calling it the times and crimes of the Bushveldt Carbineers. They weren't around very long. They were a private sort of enterprise like Steineker's horse or Brabant's horse, the Scottish horse, Kitchener's light horse. They were raised and sent up north to the northern Transvaal, and they didn't last very long, whether it's because of their behaviour or it was probably their behaviour. They're an outlaw group in the end. But let's not get too deep. So first chapter we're going to talk about the execution of the fever-ridden burgher C.J. van den Berg. The sources I'm using to tell the stories, we're going to be using Charles's book. I'm going to be showing you footage of when I was there, of the grave sites, and any talk that Charles could give me. I mean, I was so fortunate to have Charles all to myself. There's pictures in here of him taking other tour groups around that, and he's got 20 or 30 people standing around him while he's talking. Well, it was just me and him. I'll also be using, where appropriate, images from the film, Breaker Morant, any Wikipedia stuff I can find, and giving you a deep dive into the events. Well, these events today actually took place before Breaker Morant arrived. They were stationed at a place called Fort Edward, which was in a little village called Elam, where there was a hospital. Charles took me to where the Elam hospital was, and there is still a hospital there. So a lot of the events from today's episode are going to mention that hospital. We're also going to hear about some of the characters, Captain Taylor, for instance, Bulala Taylor, General Bayers, the Boer commander. We'll hear a little bit about him. These are going to be some of the central figures that play a prominent part, especially Captain Taylor. We're going to see where those orders to intercept that Boer wagon were issued from Taylor's intelligence office. All right, so strap in, buckle in, all you carbineers, because we're off on an adventure to the Spelonken, northern Transvaal.
Captain Taylor, you were with the Bushveldt Carbineers, but not actually a member of the Corps.
That's correct. I joined the Carbineers as intelligence officer at the request of Lord Kitchener. I had lived in South Africa before the war and spoke some of the native languages, as well as Dutch.
And were you senior to Lieutenant Morant?
I was senior, yes. But the day-to-day running of the Corps was left to Lieutenant Morant, although he sometimes referred matters to me.
One of the central players in the whole story of the Bushveldt Carbineers is a Captain Alfred James Taylor, who had the moniker nickname of Bulala, the one who kills, for his cruelty and his violence towards both Africans and whites during his military service. He was Irish, and he was part of the squad that founded Rhodesia. He fought the Matabele in both the Matabele wars, and he's a very shadowy character. He seems to have been working intelligence both for the Boers and against the Boers. Certainly by the time that he comes into the Spelonken and Fort Edward, he's a British intelligence officer. He doesn't seem to have any rank within the Bushveldt Carbineers, but he seems to be able to give them orders and to oversee their actions in the time that they're stationed there. So it's a little murky. I was lucky that Charles actually took me to Captain Taylor's office, where he issued the orders that we're going to hear about shortly. But yes, one of the central figures and a very shadowy, murky character is Captain Bulala Taylor. This incident Charles mentioned to me, but we didn't get anywhere near where the farm was. It was way up in the mountains of the Zoutpansberg. But so he mentioned it, and I didn't really think about it till I've been reading the book, and now I remember the story. So this is what happened. So Berg was a member of the Zoutpansberg commando, and he got malaria. This area around the Zoutpansberg was terrible for malaria, fever. So he was sent home to a farm on Blue Gumspoort Road, and he was there to recover. So he had a wife and he had a number of kids, and he had come up with a form of defence for them. If they felt they were under attack or in distress, she was to wave a bonnet, and he would be watching from a distance, and he would take action to protect the family. So anyway, about 5 or 6 days before he died, about 15 men of Kitchener's fighting scouts were accompanied by Mr. Devenish from Petersburg. And they were to remove Mrs. Vandenberg and the children to a concentration camp in Petersburg. Vandenberg, the commando, he was hiding in some rocks, and the soldiers that were there started to kill some ducks and some fowls and were hanging them over the saddles of their horses, and this distressed the children and Mrs. Vandenberg. So she waved her bonnet, and a shot rang out from the rocky outcrop, and in the exchange of rifle fire, one of the British soldiers was wounded by Vandenberg. So they called a ceasefire, and Devenish promised that no harm would come to the family as long as they looked after the wounded British soldier. And they were going to come back and take the soldier to the military hospital in Petersburg. So they confiscated Vandenberg's rifle. Devenish and his men departed. Their plan was to remove Mrs. Vandenberg and the children, but that had been thrown off by the wounding of one of their men. A few days later, a group of 6 soldiers, one of whom was Mickey Henderson under the command of Captain Bulala Taylor, was sent to Zwagesok by a local joiner. That's a local Boer who was with the British. Their mission, set out by Colonel Collenbrander, was to even the score with Vandenberg, who was still bedridden with a fever, and he was barely able to walk. So his wife and teenage daughter were ordered to bring him to the front door. Once there, he told his wife and daughter that the soldiers were going to shoot him, and he kissed them farewell. He was ordered to walk away from the house, and when he had taken only a few paces, he was slain by a volley of rifle shots. His body was callously buried in a shallow dry water furrow, and his wife and children were given 5 minutes to get your things, while the soldiers started setting fire to the house. The family was loaded onto a wagon and dispatched to the Petersburg concentration camp. The eldest of the 3 little boys were later sent together with a bunch of captured commando members to Ceylon as prisoners of war. The wounded British soldier who died a few days before Vandenberg's execution was buried by Mrs. Vandenberg and her black staff on the neighbouring farm La Orange, a short distance from their own home. The grave was marked with an iron standard and later apparently with the regulation steel British military grave marker. And some local residents still remember it well. Unfortunately, with time, the grave marker has disappeared, so the actual grave is now lost forever. Records show that this soldier was R.H. Summers, attached to the British Intelligence Department, and that he was shot and buried on the mountain above Louis Tricard on the 4th of May 1901. This is Captain Taylor's account of the event. Some years later, Captain Taylor wrote to Major Cashel, the adjutant in Bulawayo, dated the 26th of September 1905, and he described his journey to the Zoutpansberg, including the above events, as follows. I went down with 6 men following the Crocodile River till we struck the range of mountains. From there I went to the fort, which I found was occupied by only 2 men named Lottering and Erasmus. On capturing them, I found that the Boer commando was at the foot of the hills, and that they had a telephone attachment to Louis Tricard. I broke up the machine and cut off all communications by wire to Petersburg and the surrounding district. Here we had one of our men shot. By this I had to clear into the mountains owing to the firing. The Boers heard we were there. After the war, Mrs. van der Berg, who survived the concentration camp, returned to the farm. She found, gathered and buried the scattered remains of her husband in a small wooden box at the place where he had died. She was assisted by Mr. Granville Nicholson, a member of Parliament for Zoutpansberg, and a group of others who happened to be visiting the Vandenberg farm at the time. The Dutch text on the sandstone grave marker, translated into English, reads, "Heroes of South Africa for Fatherland and Freedom. C.J. Vandenberg shot dead, 10th of May 1901. An early photo depicts the sandstone grave marker resting on a large cement slab. Currently there is no cement base and the gravestone is directly on the ground. The author, that's Charles, mentioned this to the previous landowner, Mr. Mervyn Woodrow, who commented that as various tenants had leased the property from him over the past years, he could not recall when the status of the gravestone changed, and he suggested I ask a neighbour. The neighbour remembered a tenant who had heard from an old farm worker that local legend claimed that a small box and not a full-size coffin was buried there. Apparently, suspecting that something of value had been hidden in the ground, the tenant secretly removed the gravestone, broke up the cement slab, and was mortified to discover that the small wooden box contained human remains. The gravestone was hastily returned to the gravesite, but without a new cement slab.
Een zonnergedal langs die moerdiefste wal, het zij voor oorlogsdagen blij. O, breng mij terug naar die oud Transvaal, daar waar mij